this afternoon. So what we're after here is we're really lucky that we've got Katie Symons. So just proof that there are people at MB that do love and care about our building system performance. And Katie is a principal advisor, which effectively means like a really bright person here at MB, who is working not just within the building performance team, but in a special program called Building for Climate Change, which is looking at our carbon accountabilities and in particular in embodied carbon. And for those of you in industry that might be thinking about, oh man, this could be a long shot. No, it's not actually, because Katie is a chartered engineer. She's been on the industry side of the fence and now the government side of the fence. So there's no one really better placed probably within all of New Zealand to help us on this journey. So Katie has been leading the team that's developed the methodology for how we're going to actually account for carbon in our built environment. And yeah, like I say, she knows a lot more about this than the majority of us on this call. So we're really delighted. Thanks coming along, Katie. And as you know, industry is super excited about this, as is a lot of government as well, you know, local and central, and that it helps us towards our path in the emissions reduction plan, because we are one of the very few lucky industries to get a chapter devoted to ourselves, which is pretty much not where most industries would like to be. But with people like Katie, we're in safe hands to help us actually navigate and meet our requirements under the Paris Accord. Now, if all of that sounds like gobbledygook to you, it's all okay, it's all good, because Katie is actually going to explain right from first principles. So I know that we've got a range of participants here on the call. We've got people that are very expert, to people that are thinking, actually, I don't know what I've really signed up for, and this is for you. So no matter who you are, you're very, very welcome, and we would love to have your questions in the chat. We've got some pre-chat questions as well that have been forwarded in when people have signed up and registered. So really delighted for that too, and we'll be working those into the presentation. Now, Katie's got some slides prepared for us. Often this ends up taking a bit of a conversational tone. And so, yeah, please just bear with us, because if items come up that we know we've already got questions for that have come in from participants, we'll pop those in there. And if not, we'll be looking to get through as many as we can at the end of this webinar. So with no further ado, Katie, hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Thanks for that introduction. I know you've made me feel a bit nervous. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here and have this opportunity to talk about the work that the Building for Climate Change programme is doing in the embodied carbon space. Don't think I've done this to the construction sector record kind of audience before, so yeah, it's really great to meet you all, and I'm really looking forward to hearing questions, feedback. We really want to engage with all parts of the sector as we try and kind of push these changes through. So some people, I imagine we have got a range of kind of experience and knowledge of this subject in the audience, so I won't I'll try not to kind of make it try to kind of cater for everyone, and also don't know exactly how much people know about the Building for Climate Change programme. So really kind of I thought Jen and I thought we'd do this kind of in two parts and start with a bit of an introduction to the climate change programme within the building system performance branch and what we're trying to achieve before we move into a bit more technical detail about the embodied carbon methodology and work that we're doing on embodied carbon, and really framed around that methodology that we published back in February 2022. And if you're familiar with that document, that's great. If you're not, I think we'll pop the link in the chat. It's not a massive document, but it should be. But we published it with the intention of it being useful to people who already know what embodied carbon is and are already doing embodied carbon assessments of buildings, but also people who just aren't familiar with the concept and are looking for a kind of an entry point, a way in to kind of understand where to start. So perhaps I'll start. As Jen mentioned, I have got some slides, and if the magic works, you should be seeing them now. So this is where we are with the start off with a bit of an introduction to the Building for Climate Change programme. Can you see those slides all right, Jen? Are they coming up okay?
Perfect.
Yep. So we're on a program overview. So first of all, why do building related emissions matter for New Zealand? So our modelling shows that building and construction sector, currently about 15% of our what's called long-lived greenhouse gases. That's basically excluding biogenic methane, which is kind of produced by the cows. And although these charts on the right kind of break that 15% down, if we look at kind of direct emissions from buildings, it's actually fairly small. It's only about 3% of our national total. That's from burning fossil fuels within buildings for heating normally. But it quickly adds up when you kind of look at emissions that are driven by the use or construction of buildings. So there's more operational emissions. You get up to about 10% when you include emissions associated with energy, basically electricity from heating, cooling, lighting those buildings. But yeah, there's a pretty large chunk, that 5% at the top, and the blue chunk is the embodied emissions. And they are emissions associated with the stuff, the kind of physical stuff that you can see and touch in a building. So the concrete that goes into foundations, the structure that holds a building up, the finishes, the thing that stops that kind of forms the envelope, stops the weather coming in. All of that material, to make all of that material, produces emissions, and that's what we call embodied emissions. So that's how we get up to 15%. And actually, when you're thinking about embodied emissions, these charts here are just about domestic produced emissions. If you include the embodied emissions from materials that are imported into New Zealand that end up in our buildings, that blue chunk actually doubles in size. There's about the same as much. Those emissions again are from materials that are made outside New Zealand. So that's why they matter. They're pretty significant to our kind of national total. So
yeah, just thinking as well, like for people as well, if it helps, I often think about it in terms of it being a material property. So a bit like, you know, there's a durability aspect, or there might be an installation and R factor. You can think about embodied emissions being another one of those kinds of factors that helps make up a material. But the interesting thing is the identical material, depending on how it's produced, could actually have a different emissions factor.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, embodied emissions of a product could be the carbon, also known as the carbon footprint of a product. And yeah, it does depend on various ways about how that product has been made that, yeah, could account for a difference in emissions. So the Building for Climate Change programme was set up to really have two goals: look at emissions reduction, but also adaptation. We know that climate adaptation is really important, especially given the severe weather events we had earlier this year. And we set up pretty simple vision, basically, to by 2050, we're looking for near zero emissions from our buildings, but they also provide healthy places to work and live, present and future generations. So this is a kind of long-term plan, but we also want to make sure that homes and buildings are resilient to the impacts of climate change. We know that the emissions have happened already. There's an inbuilt amount of warming that we are going to experience, so we need to be ready and prepared for that. So, and that's kind of where the programme came from, but where does it fit in with the kind of policy landscape, just to kind of give you a bit of an overview. So the mandate really comes from the Zero Carbon Act that was passed in 2019. That did various things. One of the things it did is set up the Climate Change Commission, He Puarangi, as a response. So that Climate Change Commission, part of their role is to advise government on what they should do. They're an independent government organisation advising all parts of the New Zealand government to meet our climate goals towards that zero carbon goal of being emissions neutral by 2050. As part of that advice, the government is then required to respond to that advice in the format of a national emissions reduction plan. And the first one of those was published back last year in May in 2022. So that's, as Jen mentioned in the introduction, there's a chapter in that plan. Chapter 12 is on the building and construction sector. So that outlines actions that the building and construction sector needs to take in order to contribute to our collective goal of being zero carbon by 2050. So just a bit about that chapter. So our team, the Building for Climate Change team, kind of held the pen with the key lead authors for that chapter. We have 2 objectives. Number 1 objective, reduce embodied carbon of buildings. And number 2 objective is to reduce operational emissions. And that's pretty simple because it's essentially breaking down the 2 types of emissions from the building and construction sector. Within those objectives, we've also got focus areas that kind of look at different ways that we can do that. But really the headline is that there are these 2 objectives, reduce the 2 types of emissions from our building sector. This is a bit of a busy graph, so apologies for that, but I just think it is quite useful. We're gonna focus on embodied carbon, and we're gonna focus on the methodology as a step towards regulation change. But just wanted to kind of put this up to illustrate that the Building for Climate Change program is kind of bigger than that, and there are lots of other things going on. But this kind of illustrates a bit of a sort of cascade down of why we're doing lots of different things and where it comes from. So Paris Agreement, you know, international and our national obligations at the top, the vision there that we've talked about, splitting it into mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is reducing emissions, adaptation, responding to the effect of emissions, and mitigation, reducing those 2 types of emissions that we talked about, operational and embodied emissions. And then kind of down here at the bottom, we're looking at different ways to do that. So changing regulation. So for embodied carbon, that's what we're going to focus on today, looking at potentially a new building code clause that looks at making it mandatory to assess embodied carbon and eventually put a cap on embodied carbon at a building level. And then looking at the other building code clauses that already exist and what changes need to be made in there to support reductions in embodied emissions. So that's kind of where we're focusing on, but we've got these other parts of our program looking at similar regulation changes, potentially in the building code to improve operational efficiency, so reduce those operational emissions, but also some changes at legislation level, so making changes to the Building Act that gives us mandate to do things like introduce mandatory waste minimisation plans and energy performance ratings for some existing buildings. And then underpinning all of that is sort of non-regulatory or non-legislative intervention, so things that we can do to encourage people to do things differently that will reduce emissions and also improve climate resilience. So it's a bit of a busy program.
Now, Katie, I'm sure it's not just me. As soon as you see that, you know, along with all the busyness, you start looking at the words change and thinking, okay, you know, what could this mean for us as industry? Like, do you actually have timeframes for potentially implementing this or for it becoming ledge?
Yeah, so we do have timeframes, and actually I can that's one of the links we should pop into the chat. There's a work program on our website that talks about it mainly talks about the pathways and the steps we want to take to get to where we want to go to. But as anyone, well, we all know at the moment we're hotly anticipating what our new government looks like. And for anyone who works in central government at the moment, that means awaiting a kind of clear direction on what their priorities will be, because that will really influence the timeframes that we're working towards. You know, things that our new government will want us to prioritise will move faster, and some things will inevitably move slower than we would anticipate. But we are one of the things we're really want to make sure is that we're not rushing the sector into something that they're not prepared with. And for all these kind of regulation and legislation changes, we really want to make sure we've got those non-regulatory interventions in there as well, to make sure that we're supporting the sector, so that if there are new requirements, we're all kind of clear on how to achieve them, how to meet them and how to comply with them. So I'll carry on. So that's kind of all I wanted to say on the programme as a whole. So we'll go on to embodied carbon and the embodied carbon technical methodology. So what is embodied carbon? This is one of my favourite pictures. So looking at embodied carbon, I suppose, is a bit of a shorthand. We we also refer to it as whole of life embodied carbon, and this is the life cycle of a whole of life embodied carbon kind of analysis or assessment. So sometimes called cradle to cradle, where we're looking from right at the beginning of when things come into existence. So, you know, mining of the material that goes into make the aggregate that goes into your concrete, or the sand that goes into your masonry construction. So that's a cradle. So that A1, sometimes called the A modules, A1 to A3 is about extracting raw materials and making it, turning it into a thing, into a product. That's A1 to A3. A4 is getting that product from wherever it's being made to the site, and A5 is putting it in a building, kind of the construction processes. So those, yeah, we call them modules. It's a kind of terminology that the standards, sort of international standards that define life cycle assessment frameworks for construction, construction work kind of came up with this terminology, so we stick with it. So A1 to A5, those modules we call, sometimes called upfront carbon. So emissions that happen at the start of a building process, at the start of a building's life, kind of up to the point at which the ribbon is cut on day one and the building is opened. Once the building's opened and people are in it and operating it, we've got our B modules. So that's life cycle stages associated with the use of the building, maintaining the building, any repair, replacement or refurbishment activities. They get kind of lumped together. So any emissions associated with those activities, they're recorded in those B modules. There's B6 and B7, which you notice a slightly different color there. They're kind of operational emissions. We'll come on to that in a minute. But yeah, those B modules occur for the duration that the building is used. So could be anything from, you know, 10, 15 for kind of short-lived buildings, right to, you know, ideally we want buildings to last as long as possible, you know, hopefully hundreds of years. But any building will reach the end of its life, and that's when we move on to the C module. So that's C1 to 4. So when a building gets demolished or hopefully deconstructed these days, so that we can recover the stuff, the materials from it. But yeah, material will then be transported to waste. There'll be some waste processing activities, and then eventually that material will be disposed of. So they're the kind of end of life modules. We call them C modules. So emissions associated with those activities are reported in those modules. And then we have this funny one called Module D, which is just called, yeah, the words there, reuse, recover, recycling potential. So ideally, at the end of a building's life, we can, if we've deconstructed rather than demolished the building, we can take some of that material and use it for something else in another building or for another purpose. And by doing that, we might displace the use of kind of virgin material that we would have otherwise had to have made and would have otherwise caused emissions. And we can report that in the building life cycle for this building as a benefit. So we want to recognize that by thinking long term, by thinking about deconstructing and recycling stuff at the end of life, we can record that as a benefit, and the place to do that is in module D.
Yep. So Katie,
that's,
just a question. So if you are looking at that, do you have to estimate at that beginning when you're doing these calculations of what % is going to be you know, in module D?
Exactly. So it's really tricky. It's really, I mean, yes, ideally we do. And that's what makes it, that kind of end of life stuff really hard to do. In fact, not just even module D, you know, the module C and even module Bs, you know, when we estimate, you know, what are the emissions associated with kind of refurbishing, maintaining, or even operating a building. Essentially, we are guessing how the building is going to be used. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do with a whole of life assessment. Yeah.
Excellent. Are there kind of standards as well? You know, because just thinking about, like, you know, in the building code, which you know, a lot of our attendees here will be very familiar with, we've got elements that only have to be warranted for, say, 5 or 15 years. So how does that compare with the kind of work that you're doing? Like, say, for example, it was for a 15-year life cycle and it actually gets replaced at that 15-year point. Do you have to, you know, include multiples of that particular item going in to get your total sum?
Yeah, exactly. That's that's precisely what you do for those kind of replacement, that B4 module. So if we've got a building that has a intended life of 50 years, which is kind of the standard, if you've got an element that has to be replaced every 20 years or 15 years, then you know that element is going to be replaced 2 times during the lifetime of that building. So that B4, what you would do is report in that module B4, you'd report emissions associated with replacing that element twice over the life cycle of the building. That's essentially what you would do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And what would happen if people don't? I'm just trying to imagine, what this might mean for, like, say, building manufacturers or warranties, because as we know that it might be warranted for a certain point of time, but often a homeowner or someone else wants to make it last longer.
Yeah.
So is there a consideration for what would happen at the total end of life, like as a wash up, of actually what's happened versus like in the, as built, but as lived and as deconstructed compared to the initial calcs?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I guess I guess I'd say that what we're trying to do here is encourage consideration of embodied carbon at a design stage. So we want the kind of best guess when buildings are being designed, because that's when really these emissions are all kind of built in, and ideally we want those guesses to be as good as possible. Any kind of intelligence we can get, like, if something's warranted for so many years, but actually evidence shows that it's being used for a lot longer, that can go into our assessments to inform, inform the assumptions that we're using for those kind of future life cycle stages and emissions associated with that. So yeah, it's a really good point that we should be looking to kind of always use the best information available. And if something is kind of if we've got different information to what's being used, then we want to take that on board.
Yeah, just imagining, this could actually move the market, quite substantially, couldn't it? In terms of that durability. So if a manufacturer, say, knows that, legally it says 15, but it actually goes for 25, that potentially then they could start to warranty it, and it could become a source of competitive advantage to actually state the real life, if they're confident in their product.
Yeah, brands have actually got some really good data sets exactly on this, on replacement cycles for building elements for life cycle assessment purposes, and yeah, we can share those as well. To close off this slide, I draw my little cloud around these life cycle stages and show that basically embodied carbon is the ones associated. It's the ones in the blue cloud. So it's that the only ones in a life cycle carbon assessment of a building that aren't what we would call embodied carbon are those emissions associated with operating a building, so associated with the kind of resources that we use, which are basically energy and water. They're covered by, in the Building for Climate Change programme, we've got parallel work streams looking at that operational efficiency, so how we can minimise emissions from operational water and energy in a building whilst maintaining comfort of a building for users. So yeah, that's my kind of life cycle diagram. Hopefully explains what embodied carbon is. Just a bit of the history of what we've done so far in the Building for Climate Change programme on this. So back in 2020, quite a while ago now, we published a framework, and it was a consultation exercise. So it was to hear feedback, and this was and the kind of headline of this framework was the proposal to require an assessment of embodied carbon of a building at that kind of building level, so kind of integrated with the building consent system, and then in time introduce a cap so that you would have to come in underneath a certain performance level. So we asked a number of questions, and one of the things we asked was, what are the barriers that are stopping people, stopping you already assessing embodied carbon? And the one that was most cited was the lack of an agreed methodology for how to do this in New Zealand. So that's what we did next. So that kind of led on to the development of this technical methodology that we published in 2022. So we taking that lead from the framework, we developed it with a doing a targeted consultation. So we kind of tested the ideas at it with New Zealand's sort of experts, actually experts from overseas as well, but also stakeholders that we knew would be kind of really interested in it and would give us some advice on it. So we got that direction on the technical issues. But in terms of why we wanted to do it, the number one reason really was to support consistency. And I think this is a real issue that we come up with when we're with the idea of trying to assess embodied carbon is really kind of trusting the results and this concern that you might get one person to do, you might have one building and you get two different people to do an embodied carbon assessment of it, perhaps using different tools, perhaps using different data sources, perhaps using a different kind of scope of their assessment, and they'll come up with totally different results. So we really wanted to get this methodology out there to support consistency of what's already happening in New Zealand, because we know that people are doing it already, and some of them are doing it because they have to, including government agencies that are under the mandate of the Carbon Neutral Government Programme. So they have to demonstrate that those government agencies are reducing emissions in line with becoming carbon neutral very soon, actually, sooner than the 2050 target. So we wanted to work kind of closely with those government agencies, but also others in the private sector that we know are doing embodied carbon assessments on a voluntary basis. But yeah, as I said, we also wanted to make this document something for people who have never come across embodied carbon before and just don't know where to start. So we really wanted to make it an accessible document. So it's, it's about 20 pages. It's not, and hopefully there's not that much jargon in there. But yeah, the idea was to make it as an entry point. Yeah,
it certainly is. It's definitely got good plain English.
Yeah,
and it's certainly worth a read. And that is actually very interesting about those points that you're making, because that is some of the feedback that we've had as well. It's like, how can I actually trust the results? What can we even standardize some of the elements, because with the methodology there, then like the next step is the tool. So have you got any views about, like, will there end up being a single tool? Because obviously there's multiples out there at the moment, but you can get different results, and so that gets people a little nervous.
Yeah, no, we'll come on to tools and especially data. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, it is really important that we've got a kind of aligned approach to those. And I think I will say that this methodology, it doesn't, we're not saying that it's still quite high level, because it's a fairly kind of short document. To really kind of nail that consistency and kind of lock down the different variables requires a lot more kind of detailed, and that's the sort of thing that we'll be exploring when we've got a regulation and when we've got developing compliance pathways for that new regulation. So we're not saying that this is the be all and end all. It's the kind of start of the journey to get to that consistent point, because we all know that consistency is really important for when we're making decisions on whether a building consent will be awarded or not on the basis of an assessment. We really need to make sure that the system is fair and that it can't be that we haven't got that kind of variation that you get with inconsistent approaches. But we'll come on to data and tools in a minute. I just wanted to talk about some of the principles and the objective of the methodology. I mean, we've talked about it already. Consistency being the main one, but also let's not lose sight of the big picture here. If we all just go around measuring our embodied emissions, I mean, that's great, but we're not achieving anything. We actually need to reduce them. So seeing measurement as the first step towards reductions is really the key objective of this methodology. The goal is to reduce our emissions, not just to become carbon accountants. But we have some principles that we set up in the methodology that I think serve us quite well. So obviously consistency, number one. Transparency is a really important one, I think, to address that kind of trust that we talked about already. So if people don't understand the results, or maybe kind of question the results, it's not a black box. There's a way that people can kind of interrogate and see where the numbers are coming from, can see the assumptions that have been made. Sometimes, as we've discussed, you have to make assumptions. You have to make assumptions on what's going to happen at end of life. We just don't know the answers. And if people are doing that with the best information available, then that's fine. But we just want to be kind of transparent about that. Accessible and understandable is the other key. You know, as I said, we know that there's a lot of people to whom embodied carbon is a completely new thing. So we really want to make sure that this document and what comes with this work is understandable to everyone. And then, yeah, outcome driven, and the outcomes we're looking for are reduced emissions. So that's the kind of, we had those kind of principles in mind as we developed the methodology and kind of making decisions about what went in and what stayed out. Next slide. Oh, hang on. Oh, hang on. Yeah, so to achieve that kind of goal of consistency, we look at defining scopes, and we've kind of highlighted 5 areas that we wanted to talk about the scope, kind of nail down a scope for, so to make it to really allow guide decision making. So words I'll say. So when you're making embodied carbon assessments, you're always having to decide, oh, shall I include this number? Should I not include that number? In order to guide those decisions, we've kind of structured the guts of the methodology around these kind of 5 scope areas. So we've got building elements, life cycle stages, how we deal with emissions and removals, the data hierarchy, how we kind of get that consistency in the data that we're using, and the format of results. So I'm just going to spend the next few minutes going through those in turn. So the first one, building elements. So I kind of quite like this graphic, just kind of takes a building and breaks it down into systems where you've got kind of stuff under the ground, the foundations, stuff above the ground that's holding the building up, the structure, the facade and the kind of external envelope, the internal elements that aren't structural, the building services, heating, ventilation, pipework, things like that, and then kind of stuff inside it. So thinking about those building elements, think about those building systems, sorry, looking at the elements within those systems. So the first thing, the methodology, the first kind of scope area we look at is having a table that says these elements within these building systems are mandatory for an assessment. So, and then there are some elements that are voluntary. So you can account. We don't want to discourage people from not considering embodied carbon wherever possible. You know, do the whole thing if you like, but trying to make it accessible for people and really focus on where we're going to get the biggest bang for buck. The mandatory elements are the ones that we're really going to focus on. And if everyone is looking at the same mandatory elements, then we should get better consistency in terms of being able to compare results between the two. You know, comparing apples with apples is quite a common phrase for for doing that. The reason we're doing that. So yeah, that building element scope is a really important thing that we set out first.
Do you think, Katie, you'd ever move to them all being mandatory?
Well, I guess the question then is, what's all? Like, where do you stop? I mean, I kind of talk about how there's a lot of evidence to say that we know that what's called high mass elements, so concrete in the ground, concrete in the structure, basically the structural elements account for a lot of embodied carbon. So we really want to make sure that they are included in a mandatory part. But you know, as you go down the building, throughout the building, into, you know, doorknobs is kind of where I normally land at. You know, are we going to count all the doorknobs, or you know, the I don't know, picture hooks or something? You know, you can go like. You can go to extremes, and whilst we know that some people will you know, who are invested in this and are really keen and really want to know they're doing the right thing, can go as far down that road as they want. We need to recognize that we've got limited resource, and for the resource that we've got in our construction sector, we want to focus it on where we're going to get the biggest bang for buck. So you need to draw a line somewhere between, you know, the foundations and the picture hooks, and that's what we've done with this table here. Because it's really interesting that actually one of the things about embodied carbon assessment over the years is you find that as people have kind of got more into it and it's become more widespread, people count more in the building, and as you count more, it looks like your embodied carbon of buildings is going up, but that could actually be a bit perverse, because it could actually just the embodied carbon of a building might not have changed. It's just that you're counting more, and so it seems like there's more. So yeah, we've just got to watch out for that perverse outcome. I'll just move on to the next scope area. So these life cycle stages. So as we talked about, stepping through the life cycle circle diagram. Another way to show that quite commonly is in these kind of blocks. But yeah, it's the same modules. A1 to A5 is upfront, B1 to B5 in the use stage, C1 to C4 end of life, and then that module D. So what we've done in the methodology is specified that we do want a whole of life embodied carbon assessment to include all life cycle stages, to do that whole of life. Interestingly, when we went out with a framework back in 2020, we did propose, how about we focus just on upfront first? It's where we've got the best certainty. It's where we've got the best kind of data reliability. It's where people are kind of most comfortable with. You have to make fewer assumptions. But we heard from the sector a lot of feedback saying, no, we shouldn't do that. We really should be thinking about whole of life, that circular economy thinking. So thinking about, when we're designing something today, how is it going to be deconstructed? How can we recycle? How can future generations recycle the stuff that I'm putting into this building today? And what are the benefits that's gonna release for buildings or products in the future? So we heard that feedback loud and clear. So we wanted to include. We have said the assessment will include a requirement for all life cycle stages. But what we have done is said we do want to separate emissions today from emissions in the future. So how we do that, looking at that upfront emissions, always reporting them separately to those future emissions, things that are happening in the future that we know come with a lot more uncertainty.
How long is that building life cycle set for? Like, is it a standard, or do we follow the building code for 50 years, or is it up to the designer to specify the life for these, Katie?
That's another really good question, Jen. And again, we have to balance out kind of doing the right thing with getting consistency. So what we've said in the methodology is that 50 years is the kind of default life of a building, and that's in line with what's set out in the Building Act in terms of specified intended life, and in the building code in that module in our code clause B2. But we don't want that to be a barrier. Like, we want people to be designing buildings for as long as possible, but we do need to get this consistency. So we talked about the example of replacing an element that might be have a life of 20 years. If someone's assuming a building life cycle of 50 years and someone else is assuming a building life cycle of 100 years, they'll get different results for the same elements, and just because they'll have different numbers of replacement cycles. So yeah, just in the interest of consistency, we've said report results on the basis of 50 years. But yeah, we're looking at how we can encourage buildings to last longer than that.
That's great. And actually, looking at that, you can see that feedback was really valuable, because if we'd gone just for that today, those initial A modules, I guess then you start to get, like say, those perverse outcomes of people going for the lowest carbon potential. But if that building lasts for 3 years, then that really wasn't a win for anybody. And so therefore, by introducing those elements like durability and repairability, where you maybe don't have to replace the whole element, then you get those circular economy themes coming through quite strongly in terms of factoring into the specification. Those decisions.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Jen. We want people to think about buildings being built to last. So I'll move on. So emissions and removals was the next kind of scope area we want to talk about. So emissions, I think we can all understand what emissions are, carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases that result in a net increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases, which cause global warming. The opposite of an emission, sort of termed a removal. So activities that result in a net decrease in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. So this can be a bit of a kind of thorny area, because how do you kind of demonstrate what a removal is? I mean, two very common examples are an emission, an embodied carbon assessment would be reported as a positive number. So 50 kilograms of carbon per per concrete foundation or whatever. So that's reporting as an emission. A removal would be reported as a negative number. So as a result of using this material or this product, we've taken carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the two kind of common examples these are used that might be counted as a removal are the use of timber, which has come from a tree. When a tree grows, it takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you fell that tree and turn it into a timber product, and you replace, the really important thing is you replace the tree with another tree, the result is you've got a net, you've increased the kind of solid carbon content by producing a timber product, and you've still got the tree because it's been regrown. So that's resulted in a net decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's the kind of logic behind that example of removal. But another one is in the metals sector, where we've got material, metals, steel, incredibly recyclable product. If we can recycle products and steel products, and we can do more of that hopefully in the future in New Zealand with the new NZ Steel plant coming, electric arc furnace coming online in the next few years. Recycling that steel will mean that in future, for future steel products, maybe future steel buildings, we don't have to make steel from new. We can recycle that steel, and the net difference in emissions between creating new steel and using recycled steel is reported as a kind of as a benefit, a negative number, or a removal in that module D that I mentioned earlier. So the key thing that we're saying about emissions and removals in the methodology is they've always got to be reported separately. So if you've got a product, and timber products are an example, timber products, they store carbon. That's great. The trees that they're grown from sequester carbon, but let's not lose sight of the fact that making timber products also causes emissions as well. All of that machinery runs on energy that causes emissions. So what we really want to do is report the emissions and the removals completely separately. So there's no kind of amalgamation of the two, and you don't ever kind of hide an emission on the basis of a removal. So we want to make that really clear, and that's kind of in line with that sort of transparency principle that we talked about earlier for the methodology. So yeah, trying to keep it really simple and kind of, they can be a bit controversial, this idea of removal. So we want to kind of separate out the controversy by just reporting any removal that you're allowed to report under rules, but just reporting them separately.
Yeah, because there's some of that latest research that's just showing that, the life of, say, concrete as well, it continues to absorb carbon dioxide, as it continues to harden, etc. as well. So, the body of knowledge is growing all the time, isn't it?
Yeah,
so would
exactly.
there ever be a time, will it always be the calculation as at the date of that building? I'm just trying to imagine, like as information and our understanding changes, that some factors might change about how much carbon we think that is embodied in a material, or is it sort of like a stick in the sand and that's what it is on the day that it's submitted, and we go with that?
Oh, it's a perennial challenge for a building regulator. How do you deal with kind of new science? And yeah, we'll have to see how we go on that. And I guess on the basis of encouraging people to better understand the carbon impact of the buildings that our sector is designing and building and operating today, we obviously want to capture the best any new information we can. And yeah, I guess it's just the regulator's challenge to kind of keep up with that, keep abreast with that. And so if with any new requirements, we'll just have to make sure that we're still driving good outcomes, but also providing consistency to people who are trying to get building consents, trying to get provide buildings for New Zealanders. So yeah, it'll be a perennial challenge how we deal with that new science, as we call it. Yeah. I'll go on. There's only a couple more. So fourth area, looking at this data hierarchy. So data sources for where we get data for embodied carbon assessments are always really hard. So we know that there are data gaps, and we know that there's a varying quality of data available to doing embodied carbon assessments in New Zealand today. I will say I think we're incredibly lucky to have brands and the resources that they have on their website. They've got a really great data sheets, data sources, and they actually, when they present their data, they have a similar approach. Some of the data that they've got is we think is really good. An EPD is an environmental product declaration, so that's a kind of third-party verified document that has gone through, has been a product manufacturer has gone through a process. They've got someone in to assess emissions associated with their activities with producing a functional unit of whatever they produce, whether it's a square meter of plasterboard or a cubic meter of concrete, whatever it is. That kind of assessment has been verified by a third party that it complies with an international standard to do with that. So that's kind of where we are at that's kind of seen at the moment as the best we've got. We know there are some flaws and some kind of irregularities with EPDs, but that's kind of, until someone comes up with something better, that's kind of the best level of data quality we've got. Going down from there, we've got perhaps EPDs that aren't for a specific product but are kind of averaged across the sector. In fact, the WPMA, Wood Processors Manufacturers Association, did one of these a few years ago for timber products made in New Zealand. So that's a really good start for just saying this is an average for timber products in New Zealand. Here's the carbon footprints for those. And then at the bottom of the kind of the sort of least reliable data is perhaps default values that have been kind of averaged across global data that might not be sufficient for the New Zealand, or might not be appropriate for the New Zealand context, but with the lack of anything else, that's the best we've got. So the idea of this kind of data hierarchy approach is basically saying, look, be aware of the different data levels of data quality and always use the highest level of data quality you can get. Sometimes you won't have it, so you will be at that bottom level. That's fine if there's nothing else, but always kind of look for the highest level of data available. And I'll just carry on to the last one. So it's not really a scope really, but something that we wanted to get across really clearly to support this consistency in embodied carbon assessment, so get it in the methodology, is the format of results. So we wanted people, when they pick up an embodied carbon assessment, to see the results, to look at, to kind of be familiar with what it looks like. And I think that's a bit of an issue with assessments at the moment that are being done on a voluntary basis. Everyone's got their own way of presenting the results. So what we really wanted to do here is say, based on the other scope areas of the methodology, separating out emissions above the line, removals below the line, so being really clear about that, separating out emissions today, those blue bars at the front, to future emissions on the right hand side. So it's not just one number. There's in fact quite a rich kind of there's quite a few bits of information to try and understand from an embodied carbon assessment here. So just trying to get that across in a visually impactful way, but also not too complicated. And we're not saying this is what it's going to be like, but this is just an example of a kind of simple but visually impactful way of presenting the results. So yeah, that was the last area of the scopes that we kind of defined in the methodology.
That's great. And Katie, actually, this was on with one of the questions that we got earlier, which was I guess kind of aligned to the fact that this is a tool, really, isn't it, to help people recognise, at what components and what levels are happening in each of these different modules. So the question was, what is MB doing to equip regulators with the tools to be able to implement the upcoming regulations? I should say possible regulations. I should add that in, surrounding this topic. Yeah,
it's a really good question. Currently, building consent authorities, building consent officers are the gatekeeper, so they have to determine on reasonable grounds whether building consent applications meets the requirement of the building code. So putting new requirements into the building code will obviously require we'll need to support building consent authorities to understand how they make those decisions. We know that the building consent system is already under a lot of pressure, and we can't expect building consent authorities to be life cycle experts. We know that there's a lot of people in councils that are actually really keyed up and really knowledgeable about life cycle assessment and want to do the right thing. But yeah, we don't. We're working really hard to make sure that we're engaging with those kind of frontline regulators to make sure that, I mean, it's not just them having the tools, it's the people, it's the sector, you know, the applicants as well, making sure they've got the right tools to make sure that the embodied carbon of their design is being judged in the right way, you know, and can be demonstrated to comply with new requirements. So yeah, those new tools and new data. In fact, it's a good segue, I think, into the next slide, because I'd say that, you know, the methodology is really just the initial step to regulatory change. It's a step that, you know, we've published this methodology. We don't have a regulation yet. Creating regulation will require cabinet approval, will require ministerial approval. We know that we're going to need all sorts of other things as well, like robust emissions data sources, trying to get a single database really so that everyone's going to the same place. We know will be really great for consistency of assessments in New Zealand, and we're really working hard with to try and make that happen. Assessment tools that are fit for purpose. You know, we don't want for some small buildings, some kind of, you know, your sort of standalone house that perhaps uses, you know, 3604, NZS 3604, that kind of timber frame kind of standard design. We don't want the embodied carbon assessment of those to be disproportionate to emissions associated with those buildings. You know, that they're the kind of buildings that we'd expect an assessment of that to be able to be done with pretty little effort. You know, still inform the designer and the contractor, and so they can see where their emissions are and perhaps make changes that can reduce emissions, ideally make changes that can reduce emissions in the design, but it's not requiring a kind of a full-on, you know, assessment that requires, you know, multiple you know, multiple inputs and things like that. Those kind of assessments, we'd expect a different type of assessment for, you know, a large multi-story commercial building that maybe has, you know, stories underground, you know, those kind of things where the potential impact of that building is much bigger. We'd expect a much bigger effort to assess embodied carbon of that, and a tool to do that. So yeah, that's what I mean by kind of fit for purpose, you know, appropriate for the building. We know that we're going to have to do look to training to uplift carbon literacy, and it's great to see efforts that are already happening for that. You know, Brands does a really great job with their publications. The New Zealand Green Building Council has really invested in embodied carbon resources this year, and it's great to see them doing that. We also would like to see some kind of data repositories to store the results of assessments so that we can kind of get a better idea of what good looks like and start to inform some benchmarks. So yeah, this methodology isn't, you know, isn't regulation yet, and there's also other things that we need to do for regulation, and yeah, we know there's more work to do. And I think this is my final slide. I mean, for Accord members, I just wanted to leave with, you know, what do you need to know? It's not a regulatory document, it's for everyone, carbon expert or not, and it's just one of the elements needed for regulation. But some tips if you've got some time, which I'm sure not many of us do, but what can you do if you want to know more about this and you want to get more into it? Read the methodology would be a good first step. It's not, as I say, it's not a big document, but you know, be prepared for the potential regulatory change that we're proposing. Give us your feedback. You know, really interested to hear what you've got to say about this, where you can see stumbling blocks, things where you think we need to do more work. That'd be really good to hear. There's support that's already available, you know, so some of those resources that I mentioned, Brands, Enter GBC, but others, yeah, find out, have a look around what's available perhaps within your organisation. As a chartered structural engineer and a member of CSOC, I know that the CSOC organisation is doing lots of stuff, publishing lots of resources available to do with embodied carbon for structural engineers. But yeah, tell us, reach out to us, what would help you better understand and reduce the embodied carbon of buildings.
Oh wow,
I
Katie, that was
think that's
absolutely
it.
fabulous. You must have
Yeah.
answered almost every question because
Well,
we've only
well,
got
we've
one that's come through
got
while we've been live.
okay. Well, we've got a few
And
minutes left, so yeah. I mean,
that's
I'll
it.
leave those links up there, so feel free
Yeah,
to visit those things and contact us at that address there.
that is perfect. And this is a lovely one from Chris. So when we're talking about the targets, is near zero, so we're looking at the near zero emissions aim, is that say within 5% or a 2/3 reduction of the 15% or less? So
That's a
great
really good
question.
question.
Yeah. I'm
That's a
glad it's
really good
yours, not
question.
mine.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, defining what near zero, I mean, the terms net zero is also one that's up for debate. Near zero is kind of up for debate as well. I mean, we basically we're in a climate emergency. We need to get them as low as possible. And a bit like, our national emissions profile, whatever we don't eliminate to zero by 2050, we're going to have to pay to offset according to the Zero Carbon Act. So anything, anything that we can do to get those emissions down as low as possible will count. So yeah, I mean, I guess the thing about a vision, yeah, using the terms kind of near zero is a sort of a bit loose, but it's showing that that's what we're aiming for, and a 5, 10, 15% reduction in emissions from the building construction sector as they are today won't cut it. I mean, to get from where we are today to zero is 100% emissions reduction. So we need to be, reaching really kind of, I guess it's there to kind of illustrate the scale of the ambition that we need to address this task, as with, many aspects of addressing climate change.
Excellent. And Simon, thank you very much for throwing your question through as well. I'm glad that you're feeling comfy enough to share it. And the question is, hi, Katie, has there been much thought or discussion around what a carbon calculation process could look like across a large design team with multiple designers needing to contribute?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In terms of, yeah, we have had some discussions actually with stakeholder groups about that, about, who would be doing the embodied carbon assessment. And actually, I think where we're kind of landing is it's not our role to kind of define who does this. The building regulatory system in New Zealand is performance-based. In essence, as long as a building meets the building code, we're not going to kind of specify, ways to do that, or who absolutely does need to do that. But I mean, obviously, what we do need to do is make sure that whoever does do that is equipped with the tools and the means and the necessary kind of compliance pathway to guide towards achieving compliance and meeting any new regulations. So, yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll do a bit of a shout out. Keep your eye out on the BFCC website in the next, I'm hoping, week. We're going to be publishing some assessments that are being carried out already. So, assessments that are being done by people today on a voluntary basis. And we kind of put an open query out saying who would like to kind of share this with us, so we can share their work with us on embodied carbon assessment, so we can show examples of what an embodied carbon assessment looks like. So it's kind of see it to be it kind of thing. And it was really interesting. We got really a really good response, and the ones we're publishing are from all sorts of different people. We've got a large well-known architectural firm, we've got a quantity surveyor firm, we've got a small architectural firm, and we've got a government agency. So really interesting to see kind of all different people are kind of getting engaged with this and getting stuck in and doing their assessments. And at the moment, that's great. We've got to upskill a whole sector, so we don't want to be kind of excluding anyone.
Oh no, that sounds amazing, Katie. And for any of you that are actually undertaking embodied carbon calculations at the moment, we would love to hear from you. Katie's got some research going on looking at time and cost involved in doing this. So if you are interested in being involved, and of course you won't be identified, you will be anonymised, we'd love to hear from you and have you as part of the pilot group. So I think you can all agree that Katie has been amazing this afternoon. Definitely the person for the job, especially as an engineer that describes a building as stuff above and below ground. I think that's a great technical explanation of what goes on in construction. And yeah, I'd really like to say thanks to you all as well for your time and your interest today. And also, if you're really interested in the carbon story around construction, next week on Thursday at 3:30, Aotearoa, who is Katie's equivalent on the operational carbon side, which for the uninitiated is effectively the energy, so energy to heat and cool buildings, and how we can actually try and reduce that down, because obviously that's a large factor as well in our built environment. We'd love to see you there. Shout out to Guy Shaw, saw you lurking there in the background. You probably don't need to attend, as a bit of an expert in this area, but seriously, if you do want to learn more or just actually give Aaron some really difficult questions, we would love to see you there. He's really practical and pragmatic, by the way. He is also from industry, just like Katie, so understands exactly what it takes to get across the line, and again, written in plain English, and a really good introductory guide, and it will save you reading a few pages of the operational methodology too, if you'd like to come along. So we're having a bit of a pre-Christmas carbon fest here at the Accord. So if you're really interested as well, we've got a loco beacon coming up, which is Fletcher Living, that are looking at both sides of the carbon coin. So they've reduced in terms of, like, this is for residential, so looking at how we can actually make this in a programmed side of way. So like, for volume builders, they've done a development with a standalone house and also 3 townhouses where they've attempted to make that under the carbon budget that Brands has set, which is about a 1/7 of what we currently build at. And they've also looked at both like operational and embodied, and there's some really cool things they've done there around landscaping to try and get under the budget. So I encourage you to look for that. That will be coming out in probably early December. And also for those of you that are really in the green and touchy-feely space, we've had a couple of living buildings beacons as well, which are really interesting in the way that they address the whole of life emissions and Te Ao Māori principles as well. They're available on the Accord website. For those of you that are visual, you can watch the video, and if you like to have a read, there's a case study, and if you even want to do it, there's generally a how-to sitting in there too. But thanks once again for your time. We've loved having your company, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again next week. So thanks again. Ka kite.